Starting the evolution of a goblin to the peak. Chapter 1, I've become a goblin. The stars glistened in the night sky as a young man finds himself deep in the final moments of his favorite virtual reality game, Battle Worlds Online. The game had taken the entertainment world by storm, quickly rising to the highest played game worldwide. The view screen flashed with yet another mission successful notification, a common sight for the young man. His notoriety as Battle Worlds Online's rank 1 player was a well-hidden part of his private life. His secret known by only a few close friends. They urged him to reveal himself to the world and join a game club, but he flatly rejected them all. The true joy of this game was not found in the fame or the wealth, but in the escape to a world where anyone can be whatever and whoever they want to be. His name was Suda Ishii, but those who inhabit this world knew him as Blood. Oblivious to the danger that was soon to approach him, Suda prepared to log out and stretch his legs, as the capsule he had been confined to for several hours now was starting to take its toll. As he reaches for the logout option, his screen filled with error symbols in large bold red text. Desperation and fear filled Suda's heart as he attempted to force the logout, however it was already too late. The capsule that Suda resided in experienced an unprecedented surge of power, shooting electricity through his body. A blinding white light illuminated the room as the capsule exploded. With a boom that shook his apartment complex, Suda was dead. To cover up the failure of the machine, the media was silenced, not allowing a whisper of the events that had caused the death to come to light. Soon, Suda and the incident would be forgotten and become a nameless statistic, an integer. Arg. A moment passed as the throbbing pulse within the creature's head started to subside. He felt as if his entire body was on fire and his head had been struck with a metal bat. Damn! It hurts. He placed his hands in the hard, brown dirt and slowly pushed himself into a seated position. Hey? Where is this? What the hell happened? As his eyes began to clear, he found himself focusing on the environment around him. Wooden torches cast shadows on the high stone walls. The room itself was poorly lit, but he could still see enough to determine that he wasn't anywhere familiar. The damp air felt heavy in his lungs, thickened by the scent of wet earth and dust, and his mouth was filled with the taste of iron. Dungeon. He couldn't remember where he had gotten the word, but as foreign as it sounded to him, it felt that it was the most appropriate word to describe his surroundings. He gathered his strength and stood up, noticing that the torches that lit the room were still a foot or two above his line of sight. A grimace spread across his face as his eyes drifted to the floor, where he could see a pair of dark green covered feet, each one matched with 5 grotesque toenails covered with filth and dirt. Hey? What am I? His confusion grew as he lifted each foot, staring at his soles, calloused from walking without any footwear. He turned his attention to the rest of his body, noting that his entire body was covered in the dark green skin. It clung desperately to his bones, as his gaunt figure, which has obviously suffered from extreme malnourishment, didn't have much muscle on it. He rubbed his hand along his chest, feeling the rib bones pressing against the flesh as if it were trying to escape his body. His hand continued up to his head, pressing against his scalp as the last of the headache subsided. Not only was he green, skinny, and weak, but he was also bald. This was not his day. A light blue screen appeared before the creature, mildly startling it. He glanced over the information on the interface. Name. Race, Goblin. Level, 1, 0/100. Class, None. Health, 10/10. Stamina, 3/3. Mana, 2/2. Strength, 3+. Agility, 6+. Dexterity, 4+. Intelligence, 1+. Vitality, 5+. Free attribute point, S3. Skill, S-. Stab. Skill point, S1. I guess I just don't have a name. He had hoped that he would at least have something he can call himself, but now was not the time to come up with a name. Getting as much information about himself as possible was much more vital. Next was his race. Goblin. Well, that helps I guess. Having the knowledge of at least what he was soothed his anxiety slightly. Quickly reading through the stats, he noted that outside of his health, none of the numbers were double digits. Even with the little knowledge he possessed, he still could easily tell that he was a very weak monster. He continued down the list, stopping on the skills section. Skills? The creature thought aloud. Another screen appeared atop the first, seemingly closer than the larger information interface. Level 1, increase the movement speed by 10% when running on a straight line. Stamina cost, 2. Proficiency, 0%. Stab level 1, increase the piercing effect by 10%. Stamina cost, 2. Proficiency, 0%. As far as skills go, they seem fairly basic, and with only 3 stamina, they could only be used once before he would be exhausted. However, they are the only skills he has, so they will have to work. Seeing as he currently had 3 free attribute points and 1 free skill point, he had to think wisely about how to use them. Scratching his barren head, he thinks to himself that he doesn't have enough information on his situation. I'll just hold on to these for now, he decides. The goblin swiped at the information screens, causing them to disappear from his view. He searched his immediate surroundings for a weapon of any kind. After settling on a rock that was just larger than his fist, he made his way to the worn wooden door on the far side of the room. The door groaned loudly as it gave way to his tiny green hand. The rough wood matched the rest of the room, having seemingly not received care in several years. He had entered a long hallway that stretched into the darkness from his left to his right. It appears to have been decorated similarly to the room he had just left, with lit torches sporadically placed in metal sconce. The flames on the torches seemed to be ready to die out at any moment, but continuously held on, maintaining the low level of light in all directions. Turning to his left, he silently crept along with the dirt and rock floor, keeping a low profile as he followed the corridor. The long, dim passage came to an opening. The creature carefully searched the dimly lit room from the entrance of the corridor. The goblin's beady eyes darted left and right, finally settling upon a shifting shadow in the middle of the room. The light from the flames revealed a dull, off-white complexion clad in leather armor. The dull shine of iron came from the mysterious creature's hand. The goblin's breathing became slow and calm. The skeleton soldier's defense was much tougher than his, and fighting would be impossible without a weapon. As he reasoned in his mind, his heart began to beat faster, his blood rushed through his body, and his mind filled with delight. He knew it would be almost impossible to win, but his instinct lifted his body and moved his hands to clutch his rock tightly. "Let's do this," he thought as he rushed towards the skeleton, letting out a feral goblin howl. The green monster threw his stone with all his might, splintering the skeleton soldier's barren skull with a sickening crack. The skeleton stumbled from the force of the blow, opening an opportunity that would be perfect for the quick-witted goblin to take advantage of. While the skeleton was off-balanced, the goblin leaped into the air, using all of his weight to kick the skeleton to the ground. Once fallen, the skeleton was barraged with a flurry of goblin punches, each one echoing the sound of snapping bone throughout the room. As the skeleton attempted to rise again, the goblin would use as much force to kick the berated soldier back onto the ground, allowing the goblin to quickly unleash another round of blows upon the fallen victim. A cold sensation shot through the spine of the goblin. Reflexively, the green monster jumped back as far as it could as the wind from the blade of the skeleton's wild swing sliced through the air a hair's breadth away from the creature's green flesh. The goblin had sensed that he was weak, but even after landing several powerful blows which caused his hands to tingle from numbness, the soldier was still alive. The skeleton was now coated with dirt from the floor where it had been lying, and cracks had formed on the left side of the skeleton's head where the rock had hit it. Several pieces of the skull had fallen onto the floor from being struck by the goblin's fists. The skeleton soldier found its way to its feet and staggered its way towards the goblin. The goblin backed away from the creature, hoping for another opening to attack. As the skeleton soldier lifted his blade into the air, the goblin seized the opportunity to rush the skeleton, disrupting its swing. The iron sword crashed heavily against the stone, ringing loudly into the corridors. The goblin kicked at the inside of the skeleton's knee with all his might. To his surprise, instead of feeling the resistance of the skeleton soldier's bones, the goblin's foot pressed against the joint, causing the lower leg to become dislodged from the upper leg. The skeleton once again fell to the ground, where the goblin rushed to the skeleton's skull and stomped as hard as he possibly could onto the creature. With another dry crack, the skull gave way to the goblin's foot. A dinging sound pierced the goblin's mind and a screen appeared before him. You have earned 52 experience for defeating a skeleton soldier. Experience, 52/100. A heavy sigh escaped the goblin's lips as he fell back onto the now disintegrating soldier. His stamina had all been used up, causing his body to refuse his command to get up. After a few minutes of rest, the goblin arose and inspected the sole remaining artifact of the skeleton's existence. The iron sword felt heavy in the goblin's hands. As he looked over it, a notification appeared over it. Rusty sword, plus 10 damage. Durability, 2/5. The goblin inspected the worn blade and led both hands to the hilt where he gripped tightly onto the cloth-wrapped handle. He waved the box away and lifted the blade onto his shoulder where he could carry it comfortably. As he started to continue through the room to the opposite side of the room from whence he arrived, another ding echoed in his mind, revealing another translucent box in his path. Quest, S, received. Survival, survive for 5 days. Reward, 200 EXP 1 AP, attribute point. Rating, complete the dungeon. Reward, 100 EXP and 1 SP, skill point. The goblin sneered at the box. If he was this exhausted from fighting just one skeleton, how could he hope to clear the entire dungeon? The battle had highlighted his weakness. Against one skeleton he would be at an advantage due to his speed, but if there were more then he would be as good as dead. The goblin decided he would use his attribute points to boost his power. As he finished his thought, the attribute list appeared before him again. He placed his first 2 points into strength, sending a surging force throughout his body. His muscles had definitely felt stronger after allocating just those points, however, he hesitated before placing his third point on strength. Inside his little green body, he could feel that he would need more than just strength. His eyes wandered to his intelligence stat. He scoffed to himself, thinking it absurd to waste points on intelligence when he could be even stronger. However, the feeling refused to fade. Slowly, the goblin's bony finger hovered towards the plus on his intelligence. As he pressed the button, his mind felt as if it was splitting open. He dropped to the floor on his knees and grunted in pain. Thoughts, ideas, and memories that felt out of place, yet familiar, flooded into his mind, and a single name sounded through them all. Suda Ishi. As the pain subsided, the goblin could recognize his own thoughts again. He was Suda Ishi. He had died, and from his experience this far he could tell that he was no longer in the world he once knew. He fell on his butt with a mixed expression on his face as he had come to realize that he had been reborn into another world as a goblin. He held his head in his hands and curled up in the corner of the room. Ads by Pub Future. His thoughts raced at breakneck speed. How could this have happened? This can't be real. I can't be a goblin, they're so weak. Puzzled by his predicament, Suda struggled to grasp the reasoning behind his situation. After a few minutes of panicking, doubting the reality of his situation, and finally bargaining with himself, Suda cleared his mind and took a deep breath. Suda slapped his face with both hands, filling his ears with a hollow pack. If he didn't get a hold of himself, he was doomed to die in this dungeon. Suda opened his stat window again and sneered in dissatisfaction. Although goblins were known to be weak, it was much more despairing knowing that those low stats belonged to him. He sighed and waved away the window. He reminisced of when he was playing his games. This world reminded him most of his favorite game of all, Battle Worlds Online. In the game, there are players from all over the world, but most player characters belong to one of 3 groups: the humans, demi-humans, and monsters. It wasn't often that someone chose a monster character. The beginning is extremely difficult since most monsters start off with weak stats in comparison to the other two. Humans and demi-human characters had fixed stats that increased gradually as they leveled up. However, monster characters didn't have fixed stats. Instead, they had to grind as hard as they could to evolve into stronger versions of themselves. As long as the character didn't die, they could even become as strong as a field boss. Evolution. The concept was firmly in Siddha's mind, however, a fog seemed to cover any details of how it worked. Siddha closed his eyes and focused on his next evolution. As he thought, the name of his evolution seemed to come to him through the void of his newfound information. He needed to become a hobgoblin. Siddha cleared his head, now focused on his quest to become strong enough to evolve. More information was coming to him, but it was becoming harder and harder to sort out what it meant. The fog felt as if it was slowly returning to his mind, taking information with it. The intelligence stat, he thought. By using the intelligence stat he was able to get his memories back, but with as little intelligence as he currently has, he can't hold on to all of it. As his mind continued to slip back to that of a goblin, he swiftly opened up his attribute menu again. In the name field, he struggled to put in his name. It's a new start, a new life. I could name myself anything I want. His thoughts pressed against him, but at that moment he knew that he could only choose one name, his name. The name that his mother and father had given to him as a celebration of his life and the name that he had kept hidden from the world until his death. The tiny fingers pressed hurriedly on the keys and confirmed his entry. Even as a goblin, there was one thing he shouldn't forget. His name is Siddha Ishi, in his world and in this one. Siddha picked up the sword at his side, his mind now calmed to its original state. He felt as if he had forgotten something, but wasn't sure what it could be. Bits and pieces of information swirled about his head, making derailed trains of thought that would continue to cycle. Now armed with a sword, executing his skill stab would be possible. This would make fighting mildly easier, however, the main issue still existed, he had no idea where he is. Siddha breathed a silent prayer of thanks to the system for giving him a way to survive and slowly stepped into the corridor, pressing forward through the dungeon. Next chapter. Chapter 2, Soul Blood Earring. Siddha checked the EXP that he received from killing the skeleton soldier. Level 1, 52/100. He only needed to kill one skeleton soldier before he levels up. He stood up and armed himself with a short rusty sword that he got from the skeleton soldier. He looked ahead and saw that there were two paths in front of him. He pondered what he should choose. In the end, he decided to go to the left path. He couldn't describe it, but this dungeon was somewhat familiar to him. It feels like he came here before. He walked carefully as he stepped forward and entered the left path. The path was dark and the torches on the walls could barely illuminate the area. He already guessed that this was the dungeon of an undead monster. The boss of this dungeon must be a powerful skeleton knight or mage. If it's a lich, then there's no way that he could conquer this dungeon within 5 days. Lich was a powerful undead and its level hover between 30 to 40. It was a boss-type monster that can be found in a mid-level dungeon or high-level dungeon. He wasn't sure if this was a high-level dungeon just from seeing one skeleton soldier. But, the system wouldn't give him such a low reward if this was really a high-level dungeon. It must be a low-level dungeon if he would receive such reward. One must know that the higher the reward, the more dangerous the quest. Siddha saw a corpse of a goblin laying down in the pool of blood. He had an idea that the group of goblin tried to invade this dungeon but were killed in the process. That must be the reason why his body, Goblin, was inside this dungeon when he woke up. This smell is making me puke. Siddha pinched his nose. The goblin smells like a rotten fish. It's not his first time smelling this kind of thing. Virtual reality could make people feel like they were really in another world. The game could copy a person's 5 senses and Siddha would set it to the maximum so that he could really feel that he was in another world. He could smell the blood, feel the wind, and saw the bloody scene inside the game like they were real. The other people would at least turn off their sense of pain or red blood, but he hadn't. When someone cut him in the game he would feel extreme pain, and when he cut someone in the game he would see the bloody scene that he made. He ignored the corpse as he walked ahead of it. Then, he saw a wooden door 5 meters away from him. He slowly approached it while carefully looking if there were any traps. He placed his palm on the door and slowly pushed it. He took a peek inside and saw that there were 3 skeleton soldiers inside the room. 3 at the same time? I could handle it as I have a sword now and could use the skill stab. Sita muttered while looking at the sword in his hand. He went inside the room without making any sound. He doesn't want to alert the skeleton soldiers yet. He needed to swiftly take out one of the skeleton soldiers to decrease the burden of fighting them. He observed the 3 skeleton soldiers as he clenched his fingers around the handle of the sword. 1, 2, 3. Go! Sita pounced at one of the skeleton soldiers. He quickly raised his sword above his head and swiftly swung it down at the skeleton soldier. Bang! Die! Sita then pulled back his sword and used stab. Swoosh! Bang! The tip of the sword hit the forehead of the skeleton, causing various cracks to appear. The skeleton soldier fell down, but Sita knew that it was still alive. He still hasn't heard the system prompt inside his head yet. He raised his feet and heavily stomped the skeleton soldier on the ground. He then once again slashed the sword in his hand on the skeleton. The bones in the neck of the skeleton weren't sturdy enough to stay till when a metal like a piece of sword crashed into it. The bones cracked and the skull was separated from the body as it rolled on the ground. The cracks on the forehead of the skeleton spread out before it crumbled down. All of this happened in just a few seconds. You've received 51 EXP from killing skeleton soldier. You've level up. All attributes increased by 1. You've received 2 attribute points. You've received 1 skill point. Sita was sure now that he eliminated the first skeleton soldier. He then saw the other 2 skeleton soldiers charging at him. One at his left while the other one was at his right. 2 on 1, hey? The skeleton on his left side slashed its sword. Swoosh! Ha! Sita raised his sword and parried the sword of the skeleton soldier. Then, he threw a punch on the rib cage of the skeleton. Bang! He then quickly crouched down as a sword passed above him. That's close. He tripped the skeleton soldier with his foot before he smashed his elbow on its skull. Bang! He doesn't have time to finish the skeleton soldier as the other skeleton already made its way in front of him. Ha! Sita shouted as he forcefully swung his sword. Clang! Both his and the skeleton soldier's sword collided, causing a metallic sound to echo in the whole area. Sita was forced back by the skeleton soldier's strength. His level was lower than skeleton soldiers, so it was natural that the stats of the skeleton was higher than him. He knew that his strength was weak, that's why he needs to rely on his sword. The added damage of the sword was enough to cause a crack on the skeleton even if it wasn't a blunt weapon. He gritted his teeth and bent his knees. Swoosh! He used the skill dash as he charged straight towards the skeleton while pointing his sword at it. Clang! His sword crashed the few ribs of the skeleton soldier. He then grabbed its spine as he kicked the feet of the skeleton. Bang! The skeleton was smashed on the ground, and when he was about to finish it, he senses someone behind him. He immediately rolled his body sideways. Clang! He lifted up his head and looked ahead. He saw the other skeleton soldier and he squinted his eyes. He dashed and slid on the ground while slashing his sword on the knee of the skeleton soldier. He then kicked the ground as he flew in the mid-air. Along with the force of gravity, he elbowed the skull of the skeleton soldier, causing it to crack. You've received 54 EXP from killing skeleton soldier. He ignored the system prompt as he quickly moved his body and dashed to the other skeleton soldier. This is the end. He smashed his elbow on the skull of the remaining skeleton soldier with all of his might. Bang! You've received 51 EXP from killing skeleton soldier. The skeleton soldier slowly turned into ashes, fading in the air as it leaves its weapons. Hasuda breathed a sigh of relief when he heard the system. He slumped down on the ground as his tense muscles finally relax. He looked at the system interface and saw that he level up to 2. He still needs to kill 2 skeleton soldiers before he level up to 3. Level 2, 105/200. I'm extremely tired. Suda muttered as he looked at the rough ceiling. Let's rest for an hour. Suda moved his body at the corner of the room. He leaned his back on the walls while pondering his next move. He lifted his head and observed the whole room. The whole room was wide and dark. There's only one lantern at the center of the ceiling that could barely illuminate the entire room. He looked around and found that there were other 4 lanterns at the corner of the room, but there's no light coming out of it. This is a secret room. His gamer sense was tingling right now. He had an idea that this was a secret room. There's no doubt about it. He just needed to solve this puzzle. He immediately got up and observed the whole room. He felt a sense of nostalgia. It feels that he was familiar with this room, but he couldn't remember if he went here before in the game. After a dozen minutes, he found something. He was standing in front of the walls while tracing his palm at the cold wall. This is the secret door, but I couldn't open it. He rubbed his chin while looking at the wall in front of him. He then looked back at the 4 lanterns at the corner of the room. An idea came into his mind as this was familiar to him, but he couldn't remember where he completed this dungeon. He lit up the 4 lanterns of the room and it illuminated the whole room, but nothing happens. There's still one thing that I need to do. He looked up and extinguished the fire on the lantern on the ceiling, the first lantern that was lighting up the room. Boom! Suddenly, the ground shook. Suda looked back and saw that the secret door was slowly opening. As I thought. He walked forward and saw a dark narrow path. He didn't think twice as he directly stepped forward. He felt the mana here in this room was too dense, making his chest heavy. He tapped the walls and found that this was no ordinary rock. The mana here made the walls harder than the rest, making it a precious stone called mana stone. From the looks of it, it looks like a high-grade mana stone. No, he thinks that these walls shouldn't be called stone. After walking for 5 minutes, Suda arrived in front of a metal door. He opened it and looked inside the room. There's nothing inside the room except a golden treasure chest in the center of the room. The treasure chest was emitting golden light. Suda's eyes lit up when he saw the golden treasure chest. He approached it and slowly opened the golden chest. There's a lone silver earring with black orb as its design inside the chest. This. He finally remembers what it is. This earring was one of his pieces of equipment in the game. One of his powerful set in the game, the Soul Blood earring. He's lucky that he found this in the early game. He picked it up and directly wear it on his ear. He felt an overwhelming power went inside his body. Soul Blood earring, a powerful universal treasure. It could harvest the soul of every creature to increase the wearer's power. Skill 1, Harvester of the Soul, it could collect the soul of every dead creature. Soul collected, 0/100. Skill 2, Locked. Effect, +10 strength, +10 vitality, +10 intelligence. Suda looked at the detailed information of the Soul Blood earring. He still couldn't use skill 2 as it needs the other pair of earrings. The Harvester of the Soul was a skill to collect the soul of every dead creature. He couldn't directly collect the soul of a living creature. He needs the soul of a newly killed creature that hasn't left its body. If he collected 100 souls, he could use it to increase one of his attributes by 10, but every time he uses it the soul requirement gets higher. This earring feels nostalgic. Suda said with a smirk on his face. It's time to harvest the soul inside this dungeon. Next chapter. Chapter 3, Training and Eating. Suda was much more powerful now than before. A single piece of universal treasure gave him the power up above his level. Universal treasures were the highest grade treasure that can be found in the whole cosmos. He stood up and picked up his sword. With the stats he had right now, he could probably conquer this dungeon in just a single day. Well, it all depends on the size of the dungeon. I should get the other skills for now to increase my battle prowess. He rubbed his chin as he looked at the sword on his hand. First, I would try to acquire the sword mastery skill. To acquire it, I need to swing a sword 1,000 times in a proper form, he said as he fixed his posture. This was the same in the game. Swoosh! He began to swing his sword. 1, 2, 3, 4. After a few hours, Siddha finished swinging his sword and he successfully acquired the sword mastery skill. He sat on the ground as he tried to catch his breath. The muscles on his arm were sore and he could barely move it. This will boost my fighting power. He felt that this was really out of this world. When he acquired the skill, he felt he already became well versed in using swords. In the game, it will only increase the player's damage when using a sword. Also, some of the sword skills require the sword mastery skill. Sword mastery level 1, the most basic level of the swordsman. At this level, a person could be truly said a swordsman. Effect, plus 20% damage when using a sword. Siddha picked up the sword and played with it. He really felt that he was a real swordsman right now. With this, he could accurately pinpoint his stab to the bones of the skeleton. He wouldn't need to worry about not hitting the bones when he used stab. Before he was reluctant to use the skill stab as he was worried that his sword would pass through the body of the skeleton, so he mostly used his fist and elbow. But now, he doesn't need to worry as he had the sword mastery skill. The combination of sword mastery and stab was great. The added damage of the sword mastery and stab was enough to pierce an iron, not to say the bones of the skeleton. Am I really in the game or not? He said with a sigh. He doesn't have any information, all he had was the soul blood earring. This was proof that he was inside the game world. What if he died? Gamers never died, right? They only respawn. He doesn't have the guts to try this. He still doesn't want to die and he had many things that he wanted to do. He wasn't afraid of dying, the thing that he was most afraid of was the unknown. No one knew what will happen if someone dies. And one of that is to finish this game. He said with a smirk on his face. This was a super difficult game as he would finish it without dying. This was not the same as a virtual game. When he died the system will only give him a penalty. He couldn't help but tremble while thinking about this. He could dominate the game at that time because of his powerful set, unique skill, and his super high level. If he was really inside the game, he wanted to know the date right now. He wanted to know what version he starts. He could already recall most of the things in the game, which must be because of the added 10 intelligence of the soul blood earring. But the problem was that he couldn't remember anything outside the game except his real name. Siddha saw something while he was looking at his stats. He found that his EXP increased while he was practicing. So training can also increase a person's level here. It must be because this body wasn't an avatar anymore but my real body. The increase in EXP was low compared to what he gets from killing the skeleton soldiers. Suddenly, he felt his stomach growling. He still hasn't eaten a single meat ever since he transmigrates into the body of the goblin. He forgot that he had to eat to survive. His head was only filled with leveling up and forgot one of the most important things, the food. The monsters here in the dungeon were only undead. I couldn't eat something like that, plus when the undead died their body withers. He said in a low voice. There's no animals here or other monsters. Monster? There's a corpse of the goblin inside this dungeon. He exited the room and went to the corpse of the goblin that he found before. He looked at it with a frown on his face. I'm going to eat this. I don't have a choice but to eat this to survive, I still want to finish this story. He carried the corpse inside the room. He felt nausea just from the thought of eating this goblin. His face contorted in disgust. He suddenly recalled that there were torches everywhere inside this dungeon. He would at least cook the meat of this goblin before he eats it. He chopped the meat of the goblin and roasted it to the point that he couldn't recognize that it was a slice of goblin meat. Chomp! Suda directly bit the meat and quickly gulped it. He felt that he was going to puke the meat. He closed his eyes and erased those thoughts inside his mind. Suda, eat, if you don't eat you won't survive. He said to himself. He felt that he was about to cry just thinking that he would eat this every day. Suda thought that he should find a way back home. He doesn't want to stay here in this place living like this. Suda rested for a few hours before he exited the room. He was going to conquer this dungeon. He tried to collect the soul of the dead goblin, but as he expected, the soul already left its body. The soul will leave the body after 3 hours when they died. It means that the goblin died more than 3 hours from now. Hey? He just remembered that he practiced sword for a few hours and that took most of his time. Still, those skeleton soldiers. Those skeleton soldiers still had their souls on their bodies, that's why they could still move like a living creature. A necromancer had that kind of skill. They could call the soul from the hell back to the living world to serve them. But he couldn't collect the soul of those skeletons if he hadn't defeated them. He still needs to defeat them to weaken the link of soul and body, so it makes it easier to collect their soul. Okay, it's time to finish this, Suda said in a low voice as he played the sword in his hand. After getting the sword mastery skill, he really felt that he was an experienced swordsman. He exited the room and went to conquer the dungeon. He met a lot of skeleton soldiers on his way, but with his current stats, those skeletons were not a problem. He could defeat them easily with his 16 points of strength, plus his 20% added damage when wielding a sword. 10 points of strength was a big gain for a goblin like him. Every time a goblin level up, its attributes only increase by 1 point, so 10 points were equals to 10 level up. The skeleton soldiers weren't his match at all. They became his EXP pot to further increase his level. By the time he arrived in front of the boss room, he's already level 6. At this point, it's already hard to level up as he already needs a large amount of EXP. It took him 1 day before he managed to arrive in front of the boss's room. Since fighting for a whole day left him tired, he's going to take some rest. I want. Suda slowly closed his eyes and took a little nap. He woke up exactly 4 hours after he fell asleep. Ah! He yawned and he looked around his surroundings. He didn't think that he would fall asleep. He only plans to rest for a few minutes before going to fight the boss of this dungeon. He looked at his stats. Name, Suda Ishii. Race, Goblin. Level, 6, 453/1,300. Class, None. Health, 40/40. Stamina, 20/20. Mana, 34/34. Strength, 20, 10 plus 10, plus. Agility, 11 plus. Dexterity, 8 plus. Intelligence, 17, 7 plus 10, plus. Vitality, 20, 10 plus 10, plus. Free attribute point, S8. Skill, S-, Stab, Sword Mastery. Equipment skill, S Harvester of the Soul, Soul Collected, 31/100. Skill point, S6. It's enough. Suda nodded while looking at his stats. His stats were enough for this boss battle. He also managed to collect the souls of those skeletons. He collected a total of 31 souls from those skeletons. He still needs a lot of souls before he could use the skill to increase his attributes. Okay, let's do this. Suda took a deep breath while closing his eyes. After a while, he opened his eyes with a will to fight. It needs a party of players to take down a dungeon boss. But Suda always fought alone in the game. He doesn't have any party members at all. All he need was himself. He raised his hand and put his palm on the cold metal door. He pushed it open and took a peek inside the boss room. Whoosh! A cold wind brushed his face. Suda took a step forward and entered the room without hesitation. He couldn't see anything as it was too dark. Suddenly, the torches around the walls lit up and it illuminated the entire room. The room was circular, it doesn't have the four corners of a normal room. At opposite of his direction, there, a skeleton wearing a black robe. The skeleton was 2 meters in height and it's emitting a very ominous aura. On its left hand, there's a black staff with the black orb at its tip. With one look, Suda immediately knows what it is. Undead Skeleton Mage. Next chapter. Chapter 4, Undead Skeleton Mage. Undead Skeleton Mage. Suda looked at the skeleton which was standing in the center of the room. Seeing this, he finally remembers where he was. At first, he wasn't sure where he found the soul blood earring, but now that he saw the undead skeleton mage, memories of this dungeon came into his mind. He remembered that this dungeon was called Undead Sanctuary. Undead Sanctuary was a very large dungeon. It consists of 12 low-level dungeons, 6 mid-level dungeons, and 3 high-level dungeons. The ruler of this place was the powerful undead inside the high-level dungeon. He's currently inside one of the low-level dungeons. People didn't know that this place was hiding a universal treasure because they don't expect that one of the low-level dungeons here was hiding the real treasure of this sanctuary. They thought that all the good items were inside the high-level dungeons. At that time, the players already cleared all the low-level and mid-level dungeons and they were preparing to clear the high-level dungeon when Suda accidentally opened the secret door. They wouldn't expect something like that inside the low-level dungeon. The one in front of him was the undead skeleton mage, one of the bosses of the low-level dungeons here in the sanctuary. If he wasn't wrong, this undead level was between 15 to 20. A powerful opponent for the current him. A cold wind strongly blew over him. Not good. Suda quickly turned around and found the door closed on its own. Looks like I'm trapped here. A wry smile appeared on his face while looking at the undead skeleton mage. The undead skeleton mage's eye socket flashed with red light and its aura grew stronger. It's coming. Suda murmured as he braced himself. He quickly checked his equipment. He had a sword and leather armor. These were the only equipment he found in this dungeon. This fits his current body. Some of the skeleton soldiers dropped a gauntlet, helm, and boots, but those things were too large for him. It would make him uncomfortable if he forces himself to wear those types of equipment. This was not like in the game that he could just click the word equip and it would fit him nicely. Let's do this. The undead skeleton mage lifted up its staff and the black orb emitted a strange white light. A fireball at the size of the human head formed on its left side and it quickly threw the fireball at Suda. Swoosh! Suda moved his body and avoided the fireball. He then charged at the undead skeleton mage. When the undead skeleton mage saw Suda avoided its attack, it raised its staff higher. 2 fireballs formed on its side. Suda increased his speed as he moved in a zigzag pattern so that the undead skeleton mage couldn't easily aim the fireball on him. Swoosh! Suda moved swiftly and in just a few seconds, he arrived in front of the undead skeleton mage. He knows that this undead was weak in close combat battle. Tap! The undead skeleton mage quickly tapped its staff on the ground. A barrier formed around the undead and it quickly expanded like a balloon. Suda saw this and he quickly stopped on his track. He jumped backward while slashing his sword against the barrier. Clang! It finally uses a skill, Suda said in a low voice as he observed the undead. The undead pointed its staff at Suda. Several fireballs appeared around the undead and it quickly flew towards Suda. Fireball dance! Suda moved his body swiftly as he jumped side to side to avoid the fireballs raining down on him. Bang! He got hit by one of the fireballs. It pushed him back by 1 meter. His HP decreased by 10 points in getting hit by one fireball. He had a total of 40 health points and it's pretty low compared to his HP when his avatar was Demi. Monster-type avatar was really weak at first. If he doesn't have the soul blood earring, then his health points would decrease by half, leaving him only 20 points. In other words, if he doesn't have the universal treasure with him, the skeleton in front of him could 2-hit kill him. There were so many fireballs shooting in his direction. No matter what, he had to avoid getting hit. He would undoubtedly die when 3 more fireballs hit him. Swoosh! Swoosh! Shit! Sita ran as fast as he could around the room. He pulled back his arm and threw his sword on the skeleton mage. Swoosh! Clang! The sword flew at a high speed and crashed on the barrier around the skeleton. It fell on the ground without damaging the skeleton. The fireballs stopped shooting, and he knows why. The undead skeleton mage could only use one skill at a time. It couldn't use flame barrier and fireball dance at the same time. Sita wouldn't let this chance go. With a stomp of his feet, he dashed towards the skeleton mage using the skill dash. He picked up his sword and smashed it on the barrier. Clang! He didn't give up as he continued to slash his sword, producing a loud sound. Clang! 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 After a few slashes, he noticed the crack formed on the barrier. He smiled widely as he increased his pace in slashing his sword. Clang! 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 The skeleton mage tapped its staff on the ground. The barrier flashed dimly and it expanded. Om! Ah! Sita shouted as he used the skill stab. His sword pierced through the barrier and he slashed it downwards. The barrier was shattered like a fragile glass. A red light glowed in the eye socket of the skeleton mage when the barrier broke. It raised its staff in the air and dozen fireballs slowly formed. Sita quickly moved his body and dashed towards the skeleton mage. Once again, he throws his sword on the skeleton. It's different this time. Clang! The sword hit the skeleton, causing it to lose its focus. The red light on its eye socket glowed brighter. It caused a change in the fireballs forming in the air. The fireballs spin faster and it grew bigger. Ah! With a boom, Sita jumped and kicked the skeleton mage. Sita noticed the fireballs were going wildly. He immediately ducked down and grabbed his sword. Boom! Dozens of fireballs exploded in the air. It produces a powerful shockwave that swept the area around it. Sita was knocked back 2 meters away because of the shockwave. He gritted his teeth as he stood up. That shockwave cost 5 health points. If he was directly hit by that, then he would lose most of his health points. He used the skill dash and arrived in front of the skeleton mage in just a second. He launched a barrage of attacks on his opponent. Stab! Stab! The skeleton mage swung its staff. Sita saw this and he grabbed the arm of the skeleton. He couldn't afford to get knocked back once again as there's already fireball forming above the skeleton. He lifted up his sword and used it to block the staff. Bang! Although the skeleton mage was weak in frontal combat, its level was still higher than him. The damage he took was 7 points. Arg! He groaned in pain as he felt that his arm was going numb from taking that hit. His health points were less than 20 and 2 more hits were enough to take him down. He lifted up his feet and kicked the skeleton sideways. Bang! You wouldn't get away from me! He shouted as he tightened his grip on the arm of the skeleton. Once he leaves the front of the skeleton, those fireballs in the air would start bombarding him. Stab! He swung his sword like a madman trying to butcher his enemy. Clang! 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 He engaged the skeleton in frontal combat. He dodges and attacks at the same time trying to maximize his damage. Clang! 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 Arg! He was hit on the head and it caused him to loosen his grip on the arm of the skeleton. The skeleton mage waved its arm and jumped backward. Sita wouldn't let it go easily just like that. He quickly stood up and used dash to chase the skeleton mage. The speed of the skeleton was slow compared to him who's using a skill to increase his speed. Swoosh! He grabbed the robe of the skeleton and once again used stab. He only has 1/4 of his total stamina. He couldn't carelessly use his skill anymore. Just die! He shouted as he madly waved his sword. Clang! After a few slashes, the sword broke into pieces. Suda tightened his fist and launched a barrage of punches on the rib cage of the skeleton. Bang! 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 He added 5 free attribute points to his strength attribute. Strength, 25, 15 plus 10, plus. He pulled back his fist and shot a powerful punch on the skeleton. Bang! The rib cage of the skeleton was shattered. Bang! Suda didn't stop his punch and he threw another powerful punch one after another. He didn't stop until he heard the system prompts inside his head. You've received 1972 EXP from defeating the undead skeleton mage. You've level up. All attributes increased by 1. You've received 1 skill point. You've received 2 free attribute points. Congratulations on completing the raid mission. You've received 100 EXP. You've received 1 attribute point. You've received 1 skill point. He sighed in relief when he heard the system prompts in his head. He fell down on the ground as he was too tired from fighting the boss of this dungeon. He lay down on his back as he looked at the prompts. He received a lot from conquering this dungeon. He was now a level 7 goblin and a few more levels were enough for him to evolve. Goblins had a lot of evolution path. The most basic ones were Hobgoblin and High Goblin. He already crossed out these 2 from his evolution path. If he doesn't have the soul blood earring, he would be forced to choose between these 2, but now it's different. He recalled one hidden evolution of the goblin from the forum. A powerful and extremely well-versed goblin. The requirements for this evolution was that one of his stats must have reach 50. With soul blood earring in his arsenal, he doesn't need to worry about 50 stat points. The high-end goblin. Its evolution depends on the stat that you choose. Suda couldn't help but smirk thinking about his future growth. Next chapter. Chapter 5, Loot and Relaxation. Suda stood up and walked towards the undead skeleton mage. The skeleton was slowly crumbling and withering, vanishing into the air like a bubble. There's still light in the eye socket of the skeleton. It still has its will this time. Why? Suda frowned when he heard a voice directly in his head. It was a language that he didn't recognize, but he still could understand it as the skeleton was directly talking to his mind. We didn't do anything. Why invade us? It was then that the skeleton vanished and disappeared into thin air. Why? Suda muttered in a low voice. He understood that this was different from the game. The boss was not a mindless monster just like in the game. They had their own will and thoughts. They weren't a 2D character anymore. From their perspective, Suda was a monster that invades their home and kills their brethren without reason. They were just living here peacefully and he kills them, more like, he massacres them. I should be careful from now on. He said in a low voice as he squatted down and harvested the soul of the boss using the skill Harvester of the Soul. He then closed his eyes and said, "Thank you for your patronage. The only thing I could do is I will always remember your help in increasing my strength, but I will not stop, I will conquer this whole dungeon." He really couldn't help it. At first, he was seriously treating this as a game. He fought and killed them for the sake of becoming stronger. It seems that he needs to think through his every action now. He rubbed his chin and started to think about this whole dungeon. Undead Sanctuary. There's a total of 12 low-level dungeons here on the upper floor of the sanctuary. 6 of them were occupied by the undead and the other 6 were occupied by monsters. He saw a corpse of a goblin inside this dungeon. It seems that the other dungeon which was occupied by goblins were going around here on the upper floor trying to conquer every dungeon. It was different in the game. The monster here didn't spawn out of nowhere. The monster increases their numbers through breeding, and that's what happened to the dungeon which was occupied by the monsters. There's nothing that could restrict them here, so they could go out of their respective dungeon. That's also the reason why Suda fought the boss with a 50% chance of winning. He couldn't grind in the same dungeon as the monster didn't spawn like it did in the game. Their numbers grew exponentially, and at the same time, the bosses of the dungeon grew ambitious. They started to fight on their own and fought each other trying to conquer each other's dungeons. Once they know about his situation they will target this dungeon. Well, it doesn't matter to him as this will give him a reason to kill them. Once they attack him, he will not hold back at all and retaliate with his full strength. Speaking of killing, he hasn't felt anything at all when he defeated those skeletons. It just like when humans kill ants or insects. They wouldn't treat it as killing. A human would only treat someone as a murderer when someone kills their own species. Still, it doesn't feel anything like that when fighting the skeleton. It only feels like he's fighting a dummy. But it's not the same as fighting a humanoid monster. Those monsters have the vibe of humans and it was entirely different compared to skeletons. Suda then shook his head, hardly putting those gloomy thoughts in the back of his head. Stop thinking about things like this. I will do what I do normally and nothing will change. If someone helps me I repay them. Suda smirked and turned his attention to the staff on the ground. There's also the black robe of the undead skeleton mage. What a nice reward. A piece of yellow equipment. He smiled widely as he checked the details of the staff. He held the staff in his hand. Staff of undead, yellow, it's a staff made negative energy. Plus 20 mana, plus 10 magical damage, plus 5 intelligence. Durability, 8/10. Undead's robe, yellow, a robe formed when the dead rises from the grave. Plus 10% magical resistance, plus 5% physical resistance, plus 5 intelligence. Durability, 8/10. He had a satisfied smile on his face when he saw the equipment. With its durability, it was enough to last until he went to the surface. Yellow equipment was enough for the current him. There were different grades of equipment, artifact, and treasure. The lowest grade was colorless and the highest was universal. The grade of the sword that he was using before was colorless. Colorless, yellow, blue, purple, orange, red, dark, and lastly the universal was the grade of equipment from weakest to strongest. In the game, all of his equipment was universal grade treasure. The most powerful one at that. Because of this that he became the most dominant player around the world. He conquered countless dungeons at that time to complete his set of equipment. Suda stood up and wheeled the staff in his hand. He played with it for a while before he stopped. The robe was too large for his current 1 meter size so he couldn't wear it this time. He still needs to evolve first before he could wear it. Staff, hey? He looked at the staff in his hand. Back then, he was a powerful battle mage. His class was versatile to all ranges, be it melee or long range. He doesn't plan to change it. He will also become a great battle mage in this lifetime. This class was a powerful class that he used before when he was still blood. A goblin becoming a great battle mage was certainly the things he's looking forward in the future. For now, he still wouldn't be able to get a class as the requirements for getting the mage class could only be found on the surface. He shook his head and went to the back of the room. When he saw nothing there, he sighed in disappointment. It's impossible for a chest containing gold coins to appear out of nowhere. He should be content by what he received. There's only a door leading down to the middle floor here. The middle floor was impossible for him right now. The mob there were only slightly weaker than the boss here. The bosses downstairs were level 35 to 40. They were too powerful that even if he finishes his evolution he wouldn't stand a chance. He could barely kill a level 15 to 20 monsters so he shouldn't think about the middle floor for now. Okay, let's sleep for now. He said as he sat down and leaned his back on the walls. He falls asleep quickly as he was too tired from fighting the boss. Suda woke up exactly 6 hours after he sleeps. He stood up and checked his surroundings. I'm still here, I thought that was a dream. He yawned and stretched his body for a while. Picking up the staff and robe, he went out of the dungeon. He stood outside and looked at the bright ceiling. The place outside the dungeon was like a forest on the surface. Trees scattered around and there's river silently flowing. There were crystals emitting light in the whole place. So much for the name Undead Sanctuary. He muttered as he turned around and looked at the tunnel behind him. This was where he came from. For him, this was the same as the newbie village or town in the game. This place was truly beautiful. A person wouldn't associate this place to undead if they don't know its name. It's true that only 6 out of 12 dungeons were undead, but that's not the same for the dungeons below. The dungeons below were truly dark and composed of powerful undead. He walked ahead and squatted down in the riverside. He drinks a mouthful of water to satiate his thirst. He hasn't tasted water since yesterday. It's too good. Words of satisfaction escaped from his mouth. It feels like he hadn't tasted any water for a very long time. I already miss going into hot spring. Ah, Earth-chan, I miss you. He stepped in and he slowly submerged his body in the water. This time he fully intended to relax. If his memory was right, there's only fish in this river. There's no monster here, so he could peacefully relax here. Oh right. There's fish here. I also need to stack food in my stomach. He went to the surface and looked at the water. He observed and watched silently before he found his target. Swoosh! In an instant, he jumped down towards his target like a lion hunting their prey. With his current stats, it was easy for him to catch it in bare hands. Gotcha! He raised his hand and looked at the fish that he caught. Ha ha ha! This wasn't enough. I still need more. He once again dives down and caught fish with his own 2 hands. It's not that bad to relax before he meets the monster here in the sanctuary. End of the chapters.